Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on the end of the paragraph on the top of page 1212. Aleph Reish Yud Beis. So, just the flow. From the beginning of volume 3, the Rebbe Rashab began to explain Ein Oid. That Ein Oid is referring to the very revelation of the concealment itself. The revelation of the divine, of the concealment itself, of Elokim. Not just as Elokim is revealing Havaya. The moon, the night, Malchus, the letters, the Kalim, the body, the Guf, revealing the power of godliness in that. And indeed, it's not only higher than the Giluyim of Zah or any Giluyim, but it actually sustains and will feed the revelations. So essentially, it's in even a higher level. To explain that, he began Ubir Inyan, the Pasuk, Havaya, Yachetu Merivov, where God eliminates or shatters his enemies, the first half of the verse, and the second half, that he will sustain and give strength and fortitude to his king and to and lift up the horn of Mashiach. Asked a number of questions and introduced the concept that there's two levels of Havaya, one that engages in battle and one that's above battle that actually transforms, or I should say eliminates, shatters the enemy, and then he left us with a question that seemingly there's something much greater la'asid, because this will all happen in the future when you have the full revelation of the higher level of Havaya. Will be more than just shattering and eliminating, will be transforming. And that's where it left, the question. And then, Lahavin calls that, to understand all this, we entered in page 1211, we entered into discussion of the difference between Gan Eden and Olam Habah. And meanwhile, we're in the middle of discussing Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a world of revelation, of divine revelation on its own. But the human being, through our work, we increase taste for sadis into Gan Eden. We add more divine energy into it, like Adam did when he was placed into the garden. So the garden was there, it had its level of revelation. And Adam, through La'avda, L'Shamra, the positive and negative mitzvahs, tended to this garden and makes it grow even further. But it's still all in the paradigm of Gan Eden, Mamala Kalam, the divine within existence, which is greater, of course, than the rest of existence, because it's revealed divine. Okay. From that, the Rebbe Rashab went into discussion. So what are we talking about now? The spiritual level of mitzvahs or the material part of mitzvahs? We know that every mitzvah, like the Torah itself, has a body and a soul. So when we do a mitzvah down below, the body of the mitzvah is the mechanics of doing it. The soul is the kavanah, the intention, the spiritual part, the spiritual energy it generates. So when it talks about before Matan Torah, the Adam Arishan and Gan Eden, and the same thing with Avram Avinu, as he says, and the general, the Avos, the patriarchs, there it was exclusively spiritual. Because there was not yet mitzvahs possible, like he said. They couldn't do actual mitzvah, tefillin or tzitzis. So you have to say they did it on the spiritual dimension of the mitzvahs. After Matan Torah, which means today, we do both. We do the physical mitzvah, and we also have the intention. So now when we're talking about increasing energy in Gan Eden, which one is it? The spiritual speaks to spiritual, makes sense. You do something spiritual, it generates spiritual energy. But doing something, but he says, but be'emes, so in that sense, the spiritual, like he says, is the way he puts it. Let me just say the exact words. That through their spiritual mitzvahs, they created taste of sharing Gan Eden. That's what Adam Arishan did. Through his work, through his efforts, in Ramach Mitzvah spiritually, he increased energy into Gan Eden. But the MS, he says on top of page 1212, when it came to Matan Torah, even though it doesn't say the word Matan Torah, but it means later, not before by Adam and so on, we were commanded not on Ruchnis. We were commanded to do an actual mitzvah in action. It's not enough just a spiritual intention and spiritually connecting to the godliness. And B'zeh Yesishin, and there we have a mile of the Bonim, the children have a mile over their parents, meaning the Bonim over the Ovis, which refers to the patriarchs, that what? That they did not have Shmi Havaya. We are revealing Havaya through our work, because they only had spiritual, they didn't have the mitzvahs gashmis. And he gave the example of inviting, welcoming guests, the digging of wells, the maklis, the rods that Yaakov used, as I mentioned, and referred to tefillin, are symbolized tefillin. So that's the case, since our commandment is primarily in doing the action. So the main primary schar, reward, is doing to the action. Gan Eden is only a ruchni. It's only a spiritual thing, and we're talking now about something that's more powerful than the spiritual. Echu, as he concluded the last lines, I'm reading on the top of page 1212. So in other words, Gan Eden schar seems to be not commensurate with. It's lower than the action. The action is generating something greater than just spiritual energy, because it reaches higher levels than Gan Eden, basically. So how do we explain that? That Gan Eden will be a schar for our mitzvahs, not the spiritual part of the mitzvahs, the physical part. And as we said, schar mitzvah mitzvah. The mitzvah, the reward is from the mitzvah itself, and here the mitzvah has a gashmistic element. Gan Eden is not a gashmistic entity. So there's another question now that needs to be explained. And that's where we're up to on top of page 1212. So as I said yesterday, and I say again, in learning Chassidus, you have to have like a broad picture. You can't be impatient, because first many questions can be developed before you get to an understanding of the whole subject. So the Rebbe Rashab is laying out now the map of this area, of talking about Giluyim. You could see right away the connection, if you wish, to, because he's talking about the difference between Giluyim, which is Ruchnius, and something deeper than Giluyim, something that comes specifically through action in this world. Similar to what the difference between Avayo, Lakim, and Einaid, which deals with the concealment of existence and so on. But I don't want to go into the explanation because he hasn't gone there, just to show that he's building a whole case here that will be understood at the end of this. We'll understand the whole picture in a very different way, in a much broader way. Okay, so now we continue. Unless somebody has a question on what I just reviewed, I'll continue on page, the new paragraph on 1212. Anybody? Okay, good. So he says now like this. There's a parenthesis that will go like, what do we say, around 25 lines, 30 lines? A parenthesis that will go all the way till almost 2/3 down the page. The words, the last part of the parenthesis, Im HaMaisan, the word Aval Gan Eden, Shazel Gilub. So this parenthesis is coming to qualify a few things in context of what we're discussing. So remember, we're in the middle of a question here, but the parentheses will continue to develop the idea. So just bear in mind, it's a parenthesis, which isn't so common, a paragraph that begins with a parenthesis and ends in the middle of the paragraph. But here's what we have now. Okay. These paragraphs were created by the Rebbe Rashab himself. In the new edition of Ayin Beis, they're adding paragraphs just for reading purposes. But these are actually from the Ksav Yad, the writing of the Rebbe Rashab. So, yeah. So here we go. V'hagam, and though v'hagam da'idei ma'isa mitzvah nimshach gam ken tesvus began eden hatachten al kaponim. So we know that he said at the bottom of page 1211, he said the kavan of the mitzvah generates schar, Kabbalah schar in the higher Gan Eden. Ma'isa mitzvah generates rewards, which is the Gilui Elokus in the lower Gan Eden. And then he added that the Likutei Torah, it says that through Aveda, in Gan Eden HaTachten, you're higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. So you really have 4 levels. Gan Eden HaTachten on its own, Gan Eden Elyon on its own, which are both higher than the rest of the worlds. because it's a gan, it's God's special energy in these worlds. Then you have the Aveda. Aveda Sa'adam elevates Gan Eden Atachten to have even more abundance, and also elevates Gan Eden Elyon. The schar of the mitzvah, the ruchnis of the mitzvah is Gan Eden Elyon, and the Gashmis, the Mesa mitzvah is Gan Eden Atachten. But the Aveda in Gan Eden Atachten elevates it higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. That's what he said, the parentheses at the bottom of last page. I'm only referring to it because it's somewhat connected to what we're going to say now. So now, you said to me, we just learned that the Gashmis of the mitzvah reaches higher than Ruchnis. Because that's what we were commanded. It's a higher thing. It's more than just a Shmi Havaya that the others did not have. They only had Kel Shaddai. No, it was a divine that was related to existence. So it's a divine level, but it's Dai. We learned in volume 1 at length how the others were not like Matan Torah. It was essentially they cleaned the pipe, so to speak, of Mamala Kalaman to realign existence to where it was before the Chet Tzadas, before the sin of the tree of knowledge. So what they do is draw down energy, but it's spiritual energy. By Matan Torah came the Chiddush that you could change the physical world. And that's where we have actual mitzvahs in action. So fine, that we have just learned. And the question is, so what exactly is Gan Eden's role in that context, since Gan Eden is only a spiritual level? So now he's going to qualify and say that though through Maitzah mitzvahs, we just learned, as I said in the last parentheses, you also draw down Tesvus Er in Gan Eden Atachten, Al Kaponim. Al Kaponim meaning at least in Gan Eden Atachten. Not sure what he means by the Al Kaponim, but could be he's either qualifying that it's not Gan Eden Elyon. But let me see, and I'll explain in a minute. Let me just see the whole context. Sheyesh b'zeh gam ken yisur and canal. And that also creates a yisur. Like I think the canal he means here, that L'kuta Torah, that when you add Avedis Ha'odam, adds that Gan Eden Atachten becomes a higher level. Like we said, Tesvus Eris in Gan Eden Atachten. V'ayim mashin is bar le'il, dibra maschal mimona, and delve into what was explained earlier in the Maimer Mimona, as he says on the bottom, that's volume 2, page 1054. What does he say there? I'll look there in a minute. A hefesh ben Gan Eden Elyon ve Gan Eden Atachten. Oh, actually, he referred to this already. If you look on the previous page, we actually, he already referred to the Maimer Pinchas. Not Pinchas, sorry. Where is it? Yeah, by Yeshiv Yankiv. Oh, that's another place. Sorry, it's a different mimer. Okay, I just got confused. So what do you explain to Mimona? Explain the difference between the higher Gan Eden and the lower Gan Eden. That to look there, because there he discusses some of this matter, which is what we achieve through our effort. So, in a way, it seems like it's contradicting to what we just said. We just said that the Maisa mitzvah is higher than Gan Eden. And that's his question. What is Gan Eden? How is Gan Eden a reward for something that's higher than spiritual? Because it's coming from the godliness that permeates the physical world. So he said, but on the other hand, we did learn that our mitzvahs, our Maisa mitzvahs, does generate energy in Gan Eden Atachten. And it has a quality. So he's going to explain now how to understand that. So he says, Nira is like saying, the Rebbe Rashab is saying, it seems to me. He doesn't say Nira li, but Nira means it seems. In other words, to explain what the context here, and let's learn this and then we'll understand what he's saying, because I understand it's not so clear what is he qualifying exactly. So let's finish here. That this generating of energy and light in Gan Eden, mitzvah, even though it's coming through the action of a mitzvah, ubekavona levad, in other words, even though you must have the action, if you don't have the action of the mitzvah, you're not going to generate energy in Gan Eden Atachten. And if a person only has kavana alone, if there, God forbid, will not be any action, if a person just, let's say, thinks about the intention of binding the mind and the heart, but doesn't actually do the mitzvah of putting on tefillin, he says, lo yamshich klum. He doesn't draw down anything. He doesn't generate any energy. And he will not receive any reward. On the contrary, the opposite of reward, because he didn't do the mitzvah. So all the kavanas in the world are very nice, but we're talking about after Matan Torah. Before Matan Torah, the mitzvahs are spiritual, so they're basically driven by a more of a spiritual energy in the action of the person. There's no real physical act. It's all more the spiritual side of it. Like we said, mitzvah savaya. But once you have a mitzvah, you're commanded to do a mitzvah, you can't just say, I'm going to think about the spiritual elevation on Shabbos, but not keep Shabbos. God forbid. So if a person does that, they don't generate anything. And on the contrary, they actually diminish, or worse. Unless, God forbid, unless it was onus, he was forced. So someone is forced. It's a different story. So al pi halacha, you're supposed to do something. If there's a situation where you're forced and you have no choice, whatever the reason may be, it doesn't say pekuach nefesh necessarily. There's a mazid, intentional, there's shegig, unintentional, and there's onus where you're forced. Forced could be somebody kidnapped you and doesn't let you do something. That's an example. Or other situations. So then, of course, the Rebbe Rashab is just qualifying for the whole picture. If a person doesn't do it under those circumstances, it's a different story. Because then he can't do it. He can't do it if he's honest Rachmana Patra. So the Torah makes him potter from it because he couldn't do it. But independent of that, the fact is, if you don't do it in action, the kavanah alone is not going to draw down the energy. But kol mokem, he says, this is all anida. Nevertheless, tole hamshacha ba kavanah she'im ha'maisa. He says, however, in Gan Eden, to get the schar in Gan Eden, because it's a spiritual world, is dependent on the generated energy that comes from the kavanah that goes together with the maisa. So this is a chiddush that the Rebbe Rashab is saying. In other words, what I just said about Gan Eden being spiritual, yes, it's spiritual, and Maisa Mitzvah is higher than that. The fact that we said that through action of mitzvah, you draw energy into Gan Eden, he's saying that's because you do it with kavanah. The kavanah taka draws energy into Gan Eden Elyon. But Maisa Mitzvah, even though without it you don't have anything, but with the kavanah, that's what causes the energy to be generated in Gan Eden Atachten too. She'ima Maisa. The kasha Maisa Mitzvah hibe kavanah oz dafka nimshcha yedei tesu ser began Eden. When the Maisa Mitzvahs, when the actionable mitzvahs, the mitzvahs in action are done with intention, like he said, if you remember at the top of page, the beginning of the paragraph on 12:11, he said right away, Maisa Mitzvahs kasher nasim bekavana v'rusa deliba. So though you can't have kavana without Maisa, but if you want to draw the energy into Gan Eden, you need Maisa with kavana. So Maisa alone, hypothetically, if you only did the action, you perform the mitzvah, you'll get reward for it, but not necessarily will it come into Gan Eden. Let's see if he explains that. If he doesn't, I'll elaborate more.
But it will go to Olam Habah without the kavanah, right?
We're not talking about Olam Habah, we're talking Gan Eden now. So he says like this. So, okay. Which makes sense, because Gan Eden is a spiritual reality. And action alone is higher than spiritual, as we said. If you want spiritual energy, you need spiritual kavanah. Kavanah is a spiritual nature. So that's what that does. That's what happens when a person also does. I'm going to stop soon. We'll have questions and everything. Okay. And when now intention itself, there's many levels of intention. Intention could be on a very basic level. You're not just doing the mitzvah mechanically, but you're thinking about God, about God's command, about something. But then in kavanah, he says, now there's a kavanah al pi hasod. Al pi hasod means with primis atera, Kabbalah. So the deeper kavanah, hasod al primis sheba mitzvah. Hasod al primis sheba mitzvah could mean the Kabbalah's part, or it could mean the inner Soda Pnimi could also mean Navdavka Teres Asod, means Kabbalah. Soda Pnimi could be the inner spiritual elements of this mitzvah. Ubaveda Pratisha B'chol mitzvah, and the specific service that's connected to each mitzvah. Kamoi, the Shabbat Haleva Amoyach, b'mitzvahs tefillin, like when a person binds his heart and his mind to mitzvahs tefillin, that's a kavanah. He's calling that apparently a kavanah al pisod, the psad pnimi. Ukahai gavna b'chol mitzvahs. And similarly in all the mitzvahs, that each mitzvah has its deeper spiritual kavanah that's connected to it. Mamshichim teishvaseh b'gan eden elyon. Then you draw down abundant energy or increased energy in the higher Gan Eden, like we said in the parentheses at the bottom of last page. Okay, now he's qualifying that, because remember we said kavana draws into the higher Gan Eden. Ma'isa mitzvahs draw down into the lower Gan Eden. Now he's added a chidush that the lower Gan Eden Ma'isa needs also kavana. So what's the difference in the kavanah that draws into the higher Gan Eden and the kavanah that draws into the lower Gan Eden? So he says the Seid Pnimi, meaning a deeper understanding and the intentions of the mitzvah draw into Gan Eden Elyon, like he said in the parentheses in the bottom of the last page, and then now comes another form of kavanah. Kavanah b'kabbalah shamayim. In other words, you're not just putting on film mechanically, but you're also thinking about that I'm accepting God's yoke, the yoke of heaven. So it's not a specific, detailed inner kavanah where you're contemplating on the deeper hamshach of tefillin, but it's a kabbalah sel malchus shamayim, he says. Like he says in Tanya chapter 41, that you need both kavanas. The kavanah kabbalah sel malchus shamayim is saying, I'm doing this because God wants me to do it. I'm not just doing it. In other words, you're giving thought to the God that told you to do it. Like al derech birchas haTorah. But you don't just learn Torah, you make a bracha, baruch b'Torah tchila, you say, baruch atah Hashem, nesen haTorah. So that's just a kavanah that you're not just learning Torah, you're learning God's Torah. But then there's another kavanah, says in Tanya there, the kavanah of the actual specific mitzvah. Like in that context, tefillin and tzitzis has the same element. God told you to do it. But then there's a kavanah pnimis, what he calls this apisod. That's where you're thinking about the specifics, like in tefillin, binding the mind and the heart. Tzitzis is the amshach of makif and pnimi. Whatever each mitzvah has, it's deeper kavanah. So he says there's two kavanahs now. So he says, mamshichim teishuser b'ganei natacht. So the general kavanah, like kabbalah sel malchus shamayim, that this is God's mitzvah, that kavanah is what draws the energy into lower Gan Eden. Coupled obviously with the mitzvah itself, the action, because without action you don't have anything. But he's saying, but the spiritual side of the schar from Gan Eden relates to the spiritual kavanah within the Ma'isa mitzvah in the lower Gan Eden, and the spiritual reward of the higher Gan Eden comes with the deeper kavanah where you're really contemplating on the specific inner secret, like he calls the Seid Pnimi in the mitzvah. Okay. Aval bli kavanah klal, but if you don't have intention at all, either of the two, in other words, only action, ukamay peishi Yisrael, like for example, sinners among Israel. Shemalei mitzvahs kerim, in the Gemara at the end of Chagiga says that peishi Yisrael, that the sinners among Israeli Jewish sinners are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate. So they're filled with mitzvahs, but they're still called Peishi Yisrael. Why? Because they're only doing the action. They're doing mitzvahs, but they don't have any kavanah at all. It's either mechanical or mitzvahs anoshim elamodo, however you explain it. So we're not talking about someone who's not doing mitzvahs at all, God forbid. Doing mitzvahs, but there's no kavanah. There's nothing internal. It's completely mechanical. So we're not saying it's worthless. It's not worthless, but they're not mamshich. They're not mamshich. They don't increase any energy in Gan Eden because Gan Eden is a spiritual reality. It needs spiritual kavanah. So you need the Maisa, but you need the kavanah. The basic kavanah, which is Kabbalah sel, is for Gan Eden Atachten, and the deeper kavanah is Gan Eden Elyon. So that now clarifies an important point here, that the Maisa Mitzvah and Gan Eden don't have a relationship, because this is action, that's spiritual. So the spiritual part of the mitzvah, which is the intention, that relates to Gan Eden, either the lower or the higher based on the level of kavanah. But the Maisa remains something apart. And now he's going to say, before I continue, let me stop here. And does anybody have any questions? Okay. So now he's going to add, even though this is a parenthesis, he's suddenly going to introduce Olam Habah now to Gan Eden in contrast. Remember the beginning of the paragraph on page 1211 started, what's the difference in Gan Eden and Olam Habah? Gan Eden being the spiritual world that exists now, where neshamas reside. The Gan Eden as it was in the beginning of creation, which I should mention as an aside, by the way, what happened to that Gan Eden in the beginning of creation? It was in this physical world. So Chassidus explains that it elevated to a spiritual plane that's beyond the physical. That's why we can't find Gan Eden. I wrote once a whole article about it, the different opinions. What happened to Gan Eden after Adam and Eve were banished from there? Is there a place on earth that you can call the Garden of Eden? So actually in southeastern Iraq, there are people who claim that this is the place with the Garden of Eden. But I have a whole article. If you want to look it up, you could look it up on meaningfullife.com. Whole discussion, where is Eden, or east of Eden, or something like that nature, with all the different discussions of Chassidus on the matter. I'm just mentioning it because Chassidus does say it became of a spiritual nature now. That's why we don't have it. Now, how do you, but technically speaking, where is it on the map? So I suggested that perhaps it was covered up in water. So in other words, right now it's underwater, which makes it more spiritual than it is physical. You can't live there. You can't go there. You can look
But it's
it up
outside the Rebbe's room and the Rebbe's room.
Okay, that's another way of looking at it. Yeah. But regardless, he's now going to go explain Olam Habah. So he's going to say like this: and this talk of the difference between Gan Eden and Olam Habah.
Rabbi Jacobson, quick question. You asked for a question before you start the next section. Does that mean that somebody that lives a life of Torah mitzvahs and knows the sod, as the Rebbe explains, of the kavanas, when he
does not knowing the sod, it's having the kavana when you do it. Like there are mitzvahs that need a kavana. Kavana, some mitzvahs you can't do without kavana. Some mitzvahs you could do without kavana. Some mitzvahs is optional. So kavana is not knowing. Kavana is the intention when you're actually doing the mitzvah.
Well, that's what I meant. Okay. But, that comes up with like shicha and also tzedakah, when you just drop money and some poor person picks it up, you still get the reward for that. So that's without kavana. But my question wasn't that. My question is this division of upper Gan Eden and lower Gan Eden, and dividing, so to speak, the schar or the tosfos or from a mitzvah and its spiritual counterpart of the mitzvah. Is that talked about in Chassidus a lot? I didn't realize that a mitzvah is the schar of the toses or that results from it is split between these two Gan Edens. One is in Bria and one is in Tzira, I think. And the second question is that my first question is that discuss that concept of splitting the spiritual and the physical tosfos or is that a common thing in Chassidus? I just never learned this. And the second question is when a person goes up after 120 years and they're in Gan Eden. So now they said they're sitting with the crown of their mitzvahs or whatever, they're having some type of schar, whatever they've done in this world. Are they then, therefore, in order to receive or to embrace or to be involved with the spiritual schar in the higher Gan Eden, is their neshama traveling? Our neshama is traveling back and forth between these two Gan Eden Atachton and Gan Eden Elyon in order to relate or to benefit or to involve with the different levels of involvement that they had in this world, the mitzvahs they did, the spiritual side of their mitzvah and the physical side of the mitzvah.
So just briefly, so first of all, he's talking about it here. This is called Chassidus. He's discussing it right here. Is it discussed in other places of Chassidus? Absolutely. Tanya, chapter 41, and other chapters, if you go further in the 40s, they talk a lot about Gan Eden, Atacht, Gan Eden, Elyon, relatively. So it's discussed in Tanya itself and the commentaries on Tanya. Okay, that's one thing. Secondly, you have to remember you're dealing about spirituality here. You're not dealing about geographic traveling from Crown Heights, let's say, to Flatbush, or from New York to California to Israel. You're talking about spiritual dimensions here. Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asi are all spiritual dimensions. You can be doing an action right now. You can be doing a mitzvah, and you're affecting different worlds at the same time, simultaneously. And it's not like different departments. It's just different. We generate different results. In other words, when you have a person who has a full kavanah of a mitzvah, they're doing, let's say, putting on tefillin. So you have the action of the mitzvah. You have the kavanah of Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim. You're doing it, God's mitzvah. That's your intention. You also have the kavanah of Shibud Haleva Amayach, that you're binding your mind and your heart. You have all the kavanahs that he describes here, both kavanahs. So with that one action, with the intentions, you're generating a lot of energy. The energy that's going Gan Eden Atachten means a certain dimension in the spiritual worlds that are growing through your effort right now. It would be like when a person does a good deed and it affects different people. It could affect someone who's on a certain level. It could affect someone on a higher level. And the deeper kavanah that he's speaking about, that affects Gan Eden Elyon. This is not talking about necessarily where the neshama is going to reside. That's another discussion. Which neshama goes where. We're talking about right now what we do in this world and how kavanah, in kavanah draws the spiritual side into existence. So I don't see it so much as a word called split. It's just simply different effects that one's having. So if a person only has a lower level of kavanah, it doesn't necessarily pierce those higher dimensions, those higher levels. You could imagine the difference between a tzaddik davening or doing a mitzvah and a simpler person doing a mitzvah. They're both doing the mitzvah. They both are generating energy, but someone that has more spiritual connection and spiritual aveda is going to pierce higher levels pierce higher dimensions in heaven. That's how I would phrase it in this context. Now, this is the subject. More importantly, we haven't finished it yet. He hasn't yet addressed, one second, what happens with the action of mitzvahs? Is there no schar for that? So how's Gan Eden relate to that? So I would reserve, before we fully conclude anything, I would first finish waiting till we see where all this is going right now. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. So now he says like this. And this is the difference between Gan Eden and Olam Habah. I explained in the class on Sunday, I think, was that Gan Eden generally is a spiritual realm. Olam Habah refers to La'asad Love, the future when Mashiach comes. And that too has stages. So he's going to say it like this now. The Olam Habah, while etzem asiyas hamitzvah. Olam Habah, that comes, that's the reward. And remember, reward is not here like a candy that you're getting as a gift. It's a result of your effort, cause and effect. Schar mitzvah mitzvah. That Olam Habah, that is on the very actual doing the mitzvah, period. The actual ma'isa mitzvah. Well, that's why the Mishnah says all Yisrael, every Jew, has a part in the world to come, has a share in the world to come. It doesn't say Kol Yisrael Yeshlam Chelik B'Gan Eden. It says Be'olam Habah. And actually the Mefarshim there, the commentaries in Sanhedrin say, they prove from this Mishnah that it's referring to not Gan Eden. Because right away afterwards, the Mishnah says, except someone who doesn't believe in Tchias HaMesim. So if it would be Gan Eden, the spiritual Gan Eden, what does Tchias HaMesim have to do with Olam Habah? So because he says Tchias HaMesim, that's why they prove that Olam Habah is referring to the future, not the spiritual Gan Eden that exists now. So therefore, everyone has a Chelik Olam Habah. You know why? Because even Peish Yisrael, even those that didn't have Kavanah, the fact is if they did mitzvahs, they have a Chelik Olam Habah. I'll talk in a moment about how about people who have not. And what about all the exceptions the Mishnah and the Gemara speak about? Chutz, this one. I'll talk about that in a moment just to explain this. But now let's just discuss the contrast between Olam Habah and Gan Eden. V'aschad de Gan Eden dafka la ma'ase ima kavana. So Olam Habah is the schar that comes for the actual mitzvah, no matter what, even if there's no intention. Gan Eden is dafke with Maisa and Kavana. You need Maisa because without Maisa you didn't do the mitzvah. But you need Kavana because Gan Eden is a spiritual, you're generating spiritual energy. Okay, I'm going to explain this in a bit more. I just want to go further to see where he's going with this, and then I'll explain it. So it's not fully developed yet, so be patient a moment. I'm going to try to get to the end of the parentheses and then explain it. So that's the difference. V'yashleimer, and we could say, one can say, the Liyah Shagili de Gan Eden Ha'er de Mamala Kalam, being that the revelation in Gan Eden is the revelation of the energy of Mamala Kalam, the immanent energy. Like we spoke, Mamala, not Sever. Mamala Kalam, the energy that permeates and is within existence. Ulechein Ikar Hamshachwa de Aveda de Ruchnis. That's why it's primary Hamshacha, being that Gan Eden is Mamala Kalam. That's why it's primarily the Ikar. That's why the primary generating or the transmission of energy there is through Aveda Ruchnis, the Kavana. Or as it was before Matan Torah, Adam and Avram, etc. The B'madregas Mamala Kalamin, because the level of Mamala Kalamin, Yesh Hefresh Bein Ruchnis Legashmis. There's a difference between spiritual and material, between spirit and matter. To explain that very simply, because Mamala Kalamin is measured according to the hierarchy. As we'll learn in a moment, when it comes to Seviv Kalamin, there it's an equalizer, Gashmis and Ruchnis, because it doesn't not measure. Mamala Kalamin's whole idea is the energy that goes into each part of existence. Atzilus is higher than Bria, Bria is higher than Yitzira, Yitzira is higher than Asiya, Ruchnis is higher than Gashmis. Because Ruchnis senses more the divine, Gashmis is concealed. So if you talk about Etzem or even Seviv Kalamin, that's another story. But Mamala Kalam is defined by the how much divine energy there is. So there's a real hierarchy. So there's a real distinction between Ruchnis and Gashmis. So in Gan Eden, it's all relative to what you're doing with your. If you have more if you have Kavana, so if the Kavana brings that Ruchnis, you don't have Kavana, Gan Eden doesn't. You can't speak to Gan Eden because Gan Eden is subject to the Giluyim and the hierarchy of those spiritual intentions. Okay. And therefore, even though the Schar in Gan Eden, which is a spiritual reward for the spiritual part of the mitzvah, even though you still have to have Maisa, like we said, if you don't have the Maisa, you don't have the mitzvah. Now he's referring us to a Maimer back in volume 2, page 1182. They give us the page on the bottom. So even though you also need Maisa, Makol Mokim, Ruchnis. He's repeating what he said. Nevertheless, you need Aveda Ruchnis to be able to generate that energy in Gan Eden. So Maisa is always needed, after Matan Torah, of course. But you need the spiritual to generate that energy. Additionally, the Begili Zeh had a tzarich keli ala oir. So in addition to the fact that because there's a difference in Gashmis and Ruchnis, and you want to have the Ruchnis dika pleasure and delights and reward, therefore you need to have the Ruchnis in the mitzvah. He says you also need, there should be a keli ala oir. The Bechinis Mamal Kalam has a Bechinis oir b'keli. In Mamal Kalam, everything is measured. In other words, if you don't have a keli, there's nothing where the oir can hold on to. So you need a keli to the oir. And as such, the kavana is the keli to the oir ruchni of Gan Eden. If you don't have it, you don't have anything to hold on to. So it's really 2 points that he's making here. Why in Gan Eden, basically, you have the need for the ruchni is the part, and without it, you don't have the reward. Because Gan Eden is spiritual energy. Spiritual energy that permeates existence, number one, has a hierarchy between lower and higher, and Ruchnis is different than Gashmis, so you need Ruchnis. And Gashmis alone is not enough, even though the mitzvah requires the mitzvah. To do the mitzvah, you need the ma'isa, but you need the kavanah. And secondly, the kavanah is what creates a keli. Let me just explain that with 2 points. There's an expression in the Gemara, Talmudei biyodei. You could be a fine person and do all the good things in this world, but if you don't have knowledge, you haven't learned Torah, you haven't been trained, so when you come to Gan Eden, you'll be sitting completely clueless. Because in Gan Eden, they're learning Torah. So there's an expression, Talmudei biyodei. That person who learned here, comes in Gan Eden, now you learn higher levels, but you know the Aleph base. If you don't have that keli, if you just did mitzvahs in action, but a person never learned, so no one's, let's say we can't blame them, but they simply don't have the instruments. They're sitting in a classroom in Gan Eden and they don't understand the language. Because the language there is a language of Torah. Just as an example, you need a keli to receive, so you need Torah to receive the Torah. Another is the story with Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya. So he lived his whole life a very sinful life. And then it says, the last day of his life, he bent down, he cried out, and with that one cry, he says, Konei lome b'sha achas. He earned his share, elome meaning Gan Eden there, in one moment, in one shachas is 1 hour, but shah also comes from the word one movement. With ein ker, one tnuah, with one movement. Okay, he was 80 years old. But there's a problem. Tshuva catapults you right to the highest levels, especially a level of tshuva. No matter what he did in his life, true tshuva can bypass it all like an express train and put a person right into the highest levels. But there's a problem, says the Arizal. He doesn't have the instrument, he doesn't have the levushim. So let's say he's now on the highest level of Gan Eden because of his tshuva, but he doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't have the kelim for it. He didn't prepare himself. The tshuva got him there, but he doesn't understand what's going on because he's sitting with the highest level in the shamas. So the Arizal says an interesting chiddush. There was a man called Rabbi Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Yochanan Kohen Gadol was, of course, a Kohen Gadol, a high priest. 80 years he served. Well, didn't serve 80 years. Well, Shemesh Shmeinim Shanim, maybe he did serve 80 years. At age 80 or 80 years, it says he became a tzduki. He left he left the fold in some way. So the Arizal says, so you can't take away from him all the years of his avodah. He did generate spiritual energy of the highest levels. But he now does not deserve it because he messed it up. So the Arizal says that the Eiris that he was mamshich went over to Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya. So now Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya has the levushim of Rabbi Yochanan Kohen Gadol. She has both milas. He has the tshuva that brought him to those highest levels, but he was given all the knowledge and all the instruments and tools that Rabbi Yochanan Gadol had developed. So they were not lost. It's a big concept in Chassidus and in Kabbalah, this idea of how a person's levushim can go over to another in certain instances. Doesn't happen every day, but that's my point here. It's a perfect example of this idea. That's fine. You're there. You've earned your way to Gan Eden, but you don't know what's going on. So you need to have those instruments, the tools. So bottom line is Olam Habah is a different story. Olam Habah is the future. There, all you need is Ma'aseh Mitzvahs. Obviously, Kavanah always helps. But in Gan Eden, which is Olam Ruchni, Mamala Kalalman, for the 2 reasons he just gave, because there's a difference between Ruchnis and Gashmias, and you need a and a Keli, there you have to have the Kavanah to be able to generate the energy of Gan Eden, Tachna or Gan Eden Elyon. Obviously, always coupled with the Ma'aseh Mitzvah. Good. Now he says like this.
The Etzema Maisa.
Yeah, I know what I'm up to. So the begil is that it's sort of this keli al er. The begins from Malakon has the begins er be keli. The etzema ma'aser shal mitzvah ain't the begins keli al er. The actual action is a gashmistic thing. It's a physical action. So it's not a keli to the air of a spiritual air. Like it says elsewhere, the Inyan hamshachas ha'atzmus, shezel dafke b'davar gashmish eina b'bchinas kli. So it says that, now the other hand, which of course is referring more to Olam Habah, hamshachas ha'atzmus, not hamshachas ha'oyer, not ruchnius. If you want etzem, so it says in other, Chassidus talks about this in many places, where he says mokem acher, that is dafke through davar gashmi. Because gashmi, for oyer, you need a keli for the oyer. You want to reach etzem that's higher than oyer, you need something that's not a keli for oyer, which is gashmi. Like the Maisa mitzvahs. They're not a keli at all. God just wants you to do it. There's nothing about the action that makes it more, it's not like conducive, subtle, refined. God wants you to do an action. An action is a very crass activity. I don't mean crass in a bad way. It means it's a very tangible activity. So it's not a keli to Ratzon Elyon. The Eibishter wants it, so b'meila it's mamshech Ratzon Elyon. But it's not a keli. Keli and oyer is like a student and a teacher. The student is ready, so the teacher can teach him because he has a keli. Imagine a teacher sitting and trying to teach a piece of wood. The wood is not a keli. The wood is a gashmistic thing. So that God wants, Atzmus wants dafka mitzvahs ma'asis. But on the other hand, the actual action, which is why the actual action is completely not commensurate to higher levels of divine. That's why we learned earlier in volume 2, if you remember, those that the argument, the mistaken argument of those that divide between spiritual and material. If you remember, he spoke about the difference between Shemayim and Mal v'Aretz Mitachas. Because if logically, if someone would say, how do you connect to godliness? Most people would say, become more spiritual. The more spiritual you are, the more you connect. Chassidus says, you connect to the spirituality of godliness. But if you want to connect to the etzem of godliness, you need something that's not spiritual per se. That's why in all schools of mysticism, except Judaism, the best way to reach the highest levels is through meditation, through going away from the materialism of this world. Torah says, as the Rebbe writes in a letter to a conference of Jewish mysticism, that in Jewish mysticism, what's unique, that you can achieve more through an action than through a meditation. But logically, it makes more sense if a person refines themselves, so they separate themselves, they're mindful, they're sitting in a space, an oasis, where they separated themselves from material existence. It seems much more conducive, like a student who's focusing on godliness. But that's the level of the spirituality, the ruchnius of godliness. If you're talking about the etzem of godliness, the maisa, precisely because it's not a keli, reaches a place that's beyond eris and keli. I'm going to explain in a moment with a moshel to make it much easier to understand. I just wanted to see, I want to first finish the actual words. And dafka there is etzem haratzon, because a keli, on one hand, the mile of a keli is that it receives the air in it. That fits for Gan Eden. But if you want to reach a level that's higher than eris and kelim, that you need something that's beferish, not a keli. Because it's not about how well prepared you are. It's about the mere fact that you're actually absolving yourself. You're of any form of tzir and shape and form and giluyim to be able to receive the etzem that's higher than giluyim. So I'm going to give a mashal for it in a second. Let me just finish 2 more lines, and I'll explain it more. Okay. Well, Olam Habah. That's why Olam Habah, in contrast to Gan Eden, Shu Gili Pchinas Ein Sof HaSevev. This is the revelation of Sevev, transcendent energy that's an equalizer. Sevev does not fit into any container. Like Ratzon is Sevev. The Ratzon in the human body, for example, where's the Ratzon? The desire of a person doesn't have a place that it resides. The power of vision resides in the eye. The power of intelligence in the brain. The emotions in the heart. Every part of the body has air and keli. That's mamala kalam. That's the immanent faculties. We call the eris pnimim, keches pnimim, mamala kalam. Sevev kalam and Ratzon doesn't have the Ratzon to walk, and the Ratzon to use your mind, the Ratzon to feel, the Ratzon to open your eyes and see is an equalizer. So Olam Habah is from that level of Gili of Seviv, Gili of Seviv, like the Era Blikvul versus the Era Gvul, which is Mamal Kalam and Gan Eden. That's the action itself touches that higher level. But Gan Eden, which is the Gili of Mamal Kalam, and that's a measured and a spiritual energy that's measured according to Kim. You must have kavana with action. So one of the best mashalim to explain all of this is the famous mashal from the Baal Shem Tov, where on the pasuk tefillah la'ani, ki, and what's the expression? Tefillah la'ani, ashpech sichi. Yeah. So the Baal Shem Tov asks, why does it say tefillah la'ani? Lifnei Hashem ashpech sichi. That's the expression. The prayer of the pauper, before God, I pour out my words.
Lifnei Hashem yishpech sichi.
Yeah. Yishpech sichi, right. So the Baal Shem Tov says, why does it say tefillah la'ani? Why do you have to be like a pauper? There's other places that says tefillah la'osher. You're standing before God, you're pouring out your heart and soul. It's like a prayer of a wealthy person. Why like an oni, a pauper? Says the Baal Shem Tov, that the second, in order to pour out your heart to God, the etzem of God, you need to be like a pauper. And he gives an analogy. Two people were invited to see a king. One was a illiterate pauper, had nothing going for him. No knowledge, no piety, complete empty. And therefore does not appreciate all the delights and all the great majesty of the king. The second person is a literate, wealthy aristocrat who appreciates everything. They're both invited that one time in a life, once in a life opportunity to see the king himself. So first comes the wealthy one. Since he appreciates everything because he's literate and knowledgeable and educated, so he comes into the palace and he's in awe. He's in awe, first of all, of the sheer beauty and opulence and wealth of the architecture, and then the collections of art and all the precious stones and the literature and the music. He gets so enamored with it all that he misses his appointment because he really appreciates it. Then comes the pauper. The pauper doesn't know any of this. Doesn't appreciate anything. He's illiterate. He's oni. So he walks through all these chambers and goes into the inner chamber of the king, spends his time with him and asks him for everything, including the knowledge to be able to appreciate all the majesty and the beauty of the king. Says the Baal Shem Tov. If you want the Giluyim of God, so yes, then you look at the stars and you look at the celestial bodies, and you can get completely caught up with it, but it's only an intermediary. You like get stuck in the stations and you forget to meet the king. So people who get enamored with all the spiritual levels, yes, they're going to have a lot of spiritual energy, but they'll never meet the king himself. It'll distract them, which is why we say that even though, yes, it's true, there are power to the stars that God created, and there is a horoscope and astrology and there are mazalas. But why do we not look at that? Because those are instruments of God. Those are the outer chambers. They're part of God's beauty. It would be like someone gets so caught up in the beauty of nature, like the Mishnah says. Someone says, and they're walking and they say, this is a beautiful tree. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says very strong words. He's chayiv, is mischayiv benafshe. In other words, he deserves the death penalty. Why? What's wrong with saying it's a beautiful tree? Because the tree is just God's beauty and you're focusing on the means, not on the end. You're focusing on the instrument, on the axe and not on the axeman. Like you say, gagazim biyad achesiv. That all of this is just a reflection. It's like focusing on the art and forgetting the artist. Comes the oni. The oni doesn't know all of this. He's not seduced or distracted by all this beauty. So he goes straight to the etzem because the etzem is beyond all these giluyim. That's the Baal Shem Tov. Now, this is not advocating illiteracy, obviously. This is not saying, okay, it's better to be an illiterate pauper than an aristocrat that's educated. The Torah wants us to learn Torah and do mitzvahs and appreciate God. This is just explaining what can happen if you have literacy and you forget about the etzem. Because as I've been explaining throughout from the beginning, the whole point really of Ein Oid ultimately is to teach us the etzem, but together with Giluyim. That's why Ein Oid comes after Havayu Elikim, B'Shamayim Imal V'Aretz Mitachas, because you need the Eir HaGvul and you need the Eir HaBli, and then you come to the etzem. So it's really combining the simplicity. It's suspending all your sophistication. It's not eliminating it, suspending it with bittul. You stand before God in the words of the Alter Rebbe. Mili b'shamayim imchale chafatzti. I don't want your Gan Eden, I don't want your lower Gan Eden, I don't want your higher Gan Eden, I don't want your Olam Habah. I want you alone. Ich dich allein. But the Alter Rebbe was a tremendous God. You think he didn't know all those levels? Of course he wanted those levels, but he wants the etzem, but the etzem as it comes out begili. So the ultimate goal is the combination of both. Gan Eden reflects the world of Giluyim, the world of these delights. You're sitting in Gan Eden and you're enjoying Nen Miziv HaShchina. They're benefiting from the reflection of the Shechina itself, learning Torah, growing, but it's essentially spiritual growth. The Maisa Mitzvah is like the simple action, the simple act touches all the way the highest level. But we don't want just a simple act, we want both. That's why a mitzvah needs kavanah. Kavanah without a mitzvah, like he says, you don't have anything. A mitzvah, Maisa, brings you to Olam Habah, which is the etzem or the sefer of kalam, as he puts it here. The kavanah brings you to Giluyim. Like I mentioned before, if you just jump to etzem, then you're like Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya. Forget about the sins. Yet you're there, but you don't have the tools. At the end of the day, the ani is great. He touched the etzem, but he doesn't have the tools to appreciate God's Torah and God's midas. So you need a seder ishtalshlus, and you need moichin and midas. You need all the giluyim, because that's what internalizes it. Etzem without giluyim is like an experience of Yom Kippur, but you don't know how to bring it into your daily routines and your daily experiences in ways that are premium. So you need mamala kalam. This is not negating mamala kalam. This is just saying that mamala kalam has its role of internalizing, and sevav kalam has its role of giving us the experience of the divine on the divine terms that are higher than the giluyim of Eretz and Kalim. Like we spoke, that just like in every mamutza, remember Ayin Beis interface, you need the divine that relates to us. That's mamala kalam, that's Gan Eden. You need the divine that's beyond us. That is Olam Habah and Sefer Kalam. Maisa Mitzvah relates to beyond, because it's not a Keli. And the Giluyim that relates to us, meaning relating to us in a way that we understand God, we experience godliness, and we can appreciate it. That's Mamal Kalam of Gan Eden. So that's how I would explain it, especially in context of all of Ayin Beis. And it's vital to understand it all. And in a way, the Rebbe Rashab is already beginning to answer his questions, but that's because I explained it a bit more. But I'm going to stop here by the end of the parentheses, but let me take any questions that you may have.
I have a question, Rabbi, which you kind of just got into now at the very end of this year, which is how do these concepts about the effect of Mises mitzvahs with kavana, without kavana, let's say particularly, well, it could be with or without kavana. How does this relate to the gilui of, or in Ha'olam Hazeh, in the lower worlds? Meaning to say, we talked about Gan Eden, and maybe that is coincident with lower worlds, Biyah, I guess you would say. But we talk about the gilu. We talked about earlier in this Ayin Beis about the Shiur of Rabbi and Adnai, and bringing down the Or Bligbol into this world. We talked about the Seder Ishtalshalus sort of in a different way, well, focused in a different way, and I guess I'm asking, is this level of discussion about Gan Eden is synonymous with what we already learned, meaning the Mises mitzvahs were doing a gilui, or what I thought that the giluim are in, sort of to speak, this world where we live. We're trying to megala the Or of Hashem Avaya in the lower worlds. But on the one hand, that was what we learned up until Chelek Gimel. now in Chelik Gimel, this part particularly talking a lot about Gan Eden, which, at least for me, I'll speak out of ignorance, I didn't necessarily put coincidentally with this world, because Gan Eden is, you think about a place where your neshama goes, and like you were giving all these mashalim about what happens when you pass away, what happens to all the mitzvahs you do, the schar, you talk about schar, even schar itself is something that you think about capturing later. I don't know, but I'm trying to reconcile what we learned up until Chelik Gimel with what we're learning here.
There's no contradiction. Gan Eden is not in some other planet. When you do a mitzvah down below in action with kavanah, you're generating spiritual energy. Gan Eden is just a name of a place where it's stored. It's obviously all going to affect this world. Whether we see it or not is another story. You could ask me, why don't you see it? But the Gan Eden is just another dimension that we're generating divine energy, like any mitzvah. Gan Eden is just the name of the place where it's stored. It's not disconnected from this world.
I have a question, Rabbi.
By the way,
So
today's Tanya tells us why the whole mechanism for Malchus blocking everything in this world.
What's that? Let me just make sure. Did you get the answer that I said to you?
I understood what you said. I wasn't suggesting, God forbid, that, well, that was
It's not about
separate. I
God
was trying
forbid.
to-
Gan Eden is not somewhere away. God, when you generate energy
Right.
from a mitzvah right now, Gan Eden is being built for you right now in your life and in this world. Gan Eden is just a word to describe the place where it's so-called being stored, this energy. And Gan Eden is in Bria Yetzirah, by the way. That's exactly what it is. The spiritual worlds are all here. Gan Eden is
Right.
not somewhere else. They're all here. When you do a mitzvah, you're generating energy. Gan Eden is the place it's stored. Sometimes an expression used is like munach bekufsa. It's like placed in a chest. So you're generating spiritual energy that is affecting your life, the life of your family, and the life of the whole world. That's the bottom line.
Okay. No, that was very
Rabbi
helpful.
Jacobson,
Thank
I
you.
have a question to ask you. In Chassidut, we always learn also elsewhere that the difference between Gan Eden and Elyon and Tachnun is that when person after 120 years passes away, after they're in the lower Gan Eden, there is a river of fire that they say you go through, and then you forget everything about what was on the bottom, and that's the only way that you could leap to the higher world. So my question is, given the fact that we just discussed that there's two different types of kavanot, and there's one that's lower and higher. Let's say hypothetically, a person never had a higher kavanah of any kind, and he only did what it was maaseh, and maybe a little kavanah for the basic. Does that mean they get stuck at the lower Gan Eden and would never be able to go to the upper Gan Eden?
It's a good question. I would refer you to the Maimorim that he just said. The Rebbe Rashab refer us to Mimona. That's where he discusses that. So first, I would suggest looking there and see if it's explained well there, and if not, we can take it further. It's a question that needs to be explored. And in generally speaking, when a person is in Gan Eden Atachten through Avodah, they're always Yelchem Achayel Al Chayel. They're always climbing. And there's a lot of many levels here. So he didn't say here you can't go to Gan Eden Elyon unless you have Kavanah, the higher Kavanah. There are many ways to go there. But I would suggest first looking in the Maimer of Mimona, Bolok, page 1054. He talks about the Nahar Dinar there at length. He speaks about two different levels. And let's see what it says there before I answer that question. I would want to look myself as well.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
One interesting thing you said there, it's the two levels of Gan Eden are down here and up there. It's not. It's there. Up there, you're only dealing with spiritual. Here, you're dealing with it, but it's suppressed, and we can't notice it. And maybe if we look at the travails that we go through, and down here, we'll be able to get an indicator. But we're not feeling these things like we feel we're only in a spiritual world later. But it's very interesting. He said it's constant here and there. It's no difference. I mean, I love it.
That's correct. Let me put it this way. When you do a mitzvah right now, putting on tefillin today, or any other mitzvah, your body is doing it, right? You're physically wrapping tefillin. Okay? The neshama is part of it, because if you weren't alive, you also couldn't do a mitzvah. So the neshama is there. It's affecting your body. It's affecting your soul. So in a certain way, the action Maisa part is connected to Sevav Kalam, Olam Habah, which will become ultimately Olam Habah. The neshama part, which is the kavana part, is connected to Gan Eden. So your neshama right now is expanding when you do a mitzvah. Now, if you feel it or not is a separate issue. But when neshama expands, you're essentially expanding the Gan Eden within you. You have to understand that. Now, upon Me'av Esrim Shana, when a person passes away after 120 years, then the neshama is stripped of the body. So now you only have ruchnius. So obviously all you have is the spiritual reward, or the spiritual, let's call it dividends that you've developed through your lifetime. So you're fully basking in it, and there's no body to so-called conceal or limit it. But it could never have happened that you're not done those mitzvahs, like you said, Maisa with the Kavanah. So just think of it in those terms. So neshama does not traveling to Afghanistan or to some mountain when it leaves this world. It's just stripped of the physical time and space. Like I always give the example of the electricity, when it leaves the refrigerator, it doesn't leave and go to another reality. It's just not confined in a box. The body is a box. The atzmos and sevav kalaman, that's where the box is so vital. So now when the neshama doesn't have the box, it goes back to its natural place, which is Gan Eden. And that's where it's basking in and benefiting from the spiritual energies it created throughout its lifetime through the mitzvahs, the kavanas that we did. Mitzvahs and kavanas, I should say. Gan Eden Atach and Gan Eden Elyon are just two levels of spiritual energy. And I say just, I don't mean just, but they're basically in this context. One is referring to the kavana that draws down so-called lower spiritual energy, and Gan Eden is a higher spiritual energy, which comes through the deeper kavana. But we need to explain what that means exactly. He's not explaining the difference between the two levels of Gan Eden here. That's why he referred to Mimana, the mimer, back in volume 2. Okay, yeah.
Is one Gan Eden of Elyon versus Tachton, is that separated? Let's say you said Gan Eden, I wasn't sure if you meant Tachton, was sort of in Biyar, Bria and Yitzira, and then Gan Eden Elyon, is that like Atzilus or is it above Atzilus, Atzmos?
No, in a few classes I explained, generally speaking, Gan Eden Tachton is usually Yitzira, Gan Eden Elyon is usually Bria. But he said in the parentheses in the last page that Gan Eden Elyon, he said, is Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus, and Gan Eden Tachten is, he doesn't say what Gan Eden Tachten is. He said, let's see, Gan Eden Malchus. Yeah, he says Gan Eden in general is Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus. But generally it's spoken different in Bria Yitzira, but the truth is, these are spiritual levels that can be in many places. There's a lot of relative stuff going on here.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, any other questions?
Quick question, just that story about the Baal Shem Tov, the Arizal and Yochanan ben HaKohen Gadol. Did it work the other way? That Elazar ben Gedalia, he got the Levushin of Yochanan ben Gadol of 80 years. Did Yochanan Gadol get the tshuva of
No, Yochanan Kohen Gadol unfortunately lost his share because he ended his life not in a good way.
Right, but so that's what I'm asking. Did it reverse? Man, the one gave one and the other gave the Milo of tshuva that he so to speak could.
You can't give someone tshuva. You have to do tshuva yourself.
So it just worked one way. You didn't have kalim, so you got the kalim of Torah and mitzvahs, of the gilui.
Bottom line is that what Yochanan Gadol accomplished, Blezman died. You're talking about the future. Yochanan Gadol, I'm sure, in some way made his tikkun some point.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Well, there's more to say about the Olam Habah part, but I'll talk about this in the next class. So we'll stop here. We did the parentheses, which seems more than a parentheses. This is quite fundamental to the whole subject matter, but that's fine. So 2/3 down on page